When you say you get sick all the time, are you a hypochondriac, or are you the opposite? You've got a weak system and you are a weak immune system. You are sick all the time, but you're like, nah, just fucking harden the fuck up and get on with it. And so you're walking around with ailments all the time.
I'm not a hypochondriac. I'm just fucking sick all the time. I have a weak system. I have a weak stomach. Like I like to drink, but I can't drink. It doesn't take a lot to, one, make me hungover, and two, to make me incredibly ill. Like if I mix anything, the slightest amount, I am going to vomit. So my body just isn't prepared for any of this shit. And so no, it's not hypochondria. I get sick.
All right. Yeah. Well, I found that in the past where I've been sick all the time and I put my head in the sand about it, I'm like, no, I just need to get on with life and live my life. Eventually that comes around and just destroys you. Because you think about it, it's like your immune system's always, it's kind of like putting out like it's always engaged when you're sick all the time. And then eventually it's like, I give the fuck up and something comes across and destroys you. So maybe that's going to be COVID for you. But anyway, what the fuck? I'm not a doctor. Why the fuck am I telling you this? I don't know shit. So please ignore all this.
You're a doctor. God damn it.
Yeah. Let's talk about Vince Champ.
Well,
perhaps the unfunniest comedian of all time.
Well, here's the thing. How do I even preface this? I looked, because there aren't that many videos on him, but I did look up the one where Rosie O'Donnell introduces him.
I saw that as well.
And I was thinking, like, take everything you know about the guy aside. He was like the most middle of the road average comedian. I chuckled, which I caught myself doing. I was like, oh, I shouldn't be laughing because I know who this guy is. But you know what it reminded me of? Have you seen the movie The King of Comedy?
Yes. Yeah.
So in that movie, like the hero, Robert De Niro's character, is a piece of shit that's not hidden. Like, he's selfish, manipulative, and he goes to extreme lengths. He kidnaps a guy, and even though the gun's fake, he implies that he's going to kill the guy just to be given his 3 minutes of airtime. And after all this, you think, okay, this guy's a freak. There's no way his stand-up act could be any good. But like, one of the best twists in the movie is he's not bad. He's not great. He's memorable. But he's a comedian you could see being on late night TV. Like, someone, your middle American aunts and uncles wouldn't mind watching. Be like, oh, I saw him on Fallon. He was pretty funny. And that's kind of what Vince Champ was. Is like, okay, this guy's fucking average.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think it is unfair of me to say the unfunniest comedian of all time. I guess I am I'm bundling together his Existential Impact. And this is another funny one where in the past, in past episodes, we've maybe spoke about people from bygone eras or people who have just dead. And this guy is in a jail cell somewhere. I think he's still 60 years old. So that's a funny thought. You know, you can kind of compartmentalize and just assume, oh, this happened in the 90s, but this guy is sitting with this somewhere and probably rethinking everything he did, which is a bizarre kind of thing. But yeah, I watched the same stand-up clip, and I believe the first thing that jumped out at me was just, and he referenced it in his act, was his voice. I'm not sure if it's his regular voice, at least his stage voice is the Dave Chappelle doing the white guy voice.
Yeah,
Hi.
Which immediately is like, I mean, it's almost too obvious, but like, Dave Chappelle as his white guy character needs to play this guy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Yeah,
That's
true.
Sounds like.
Yeah, well, so for those not familiar, and I got hip to this because I've listened to comedians' podcasts for many years, and this story was always kind of referenced. And I think there's an infamous aside on comedians in cars getting coffee, the Norm Macdonald episode, where they're talking about this, and Norm Macdonald makes a joke. He says he's a real jerk, and as only Norm could. But so just to give you an overview, if you're unfamiliar with the champ, Vincent Not Vincent, Vinson, Vinson, Horace Champ, born in 1961, is a former American comedian and convicted rapist. He was the winner of Star Search in 1992, which by all accounts was a pretty big deal back in the day. It was I know Dave Chappelle was on that. He won Star Search in the early 90s, at some point, late 80s, early 90s. But anyway, in 97, Champ was identified as a serial rapist when his DNA and tour schedule were matched up with a series of rapes on college campuses. Is currently serving a 30 to 40 year sentence in Nebraska State Penitentiary. His projected release date is in 2033, after which he'll begin 2 consecutive life term sentences. So he's not getting out, long story short. But yeah, in terms of what essentially he did, it was he was on the college circuit. And he was known as a nice, respectful comedian who only did clean material, which made him a favorite for college bookers. And yeah, and then I think that the first instance of him getting in trouble with the law was he apparently physically attacked his 17-year-old former girlfriend in 1996. And then from
he would have been 35, 36 at this point.
Yeah. He was. Yeah, you're right. 35 because he's born in 61. So that's pretty sus. Double his girlfriend's age. Yep. And beyond there, it's just kind of like a litany of trouble where he seemed like the chip started to fall the next year, where he was spotted fleeing the scene of an attempted rape in California. And then he was arrested for that, but then they let him out on bail. He went to the Caribbean, and then when he returned a month later, he was arrested at Newark Airport in New Jersey because after detectives in Omaha, Nebraska connected him to a similar rape at the University of Nebraska. And then this is a cool, well, not a cool line, but just kind of a chilling line. So at the time of his arrest, one of Champ's booking agents commented that Champ's schedule resembled a roadmap of where these rapes occurred. And that reminded me of in Home Alone, Home Alone 1, where they're like, we're the wet bandits. It's our trademark. And they leave the fucking taps on. And then the cop at the end is like, we know every goddamn house you've hit, you moron. So that's kind of what Champ has done here with his college. So this guy was going to college towns, performing at the college as a stand-up, and then afterwards. And from my research, he seemed like he had some standard moves where he would find a woman on their own, which is pretty stock standard rapist MO, but then he would have like a specific way of doing it. He'd cover their face so they couldn't identify him, and that apparently fucked over the investigators for the longest time because they thought he was white from the way he spoke. So this wasn't just an onstage thing.
Dave Chappelle skit right there. Like yeah, I'm not trying to make light of this, but that's insane, like that tidbit.
Yeah, well, it did that got me thinking in terms of have you ever I can't recall, I'm not even sure if this is real, but there's like a YouTube video of like Michael Jackson real voice, where like in interviews Michael Jackson, everybody knows the Michael Jackson voice, but there was apparently some like him, behind the scenes in the studio where he's like, what the fuck, y'all? He went full street. And it was like, it's terrifying because you're like, I thought this guy was like friendly. But the real kind of monster came out. Well, not the real monster.
I have a hard time understanding what's reality and that sounds like like a deleted scene from a Dave Chappelle episode. That's not like that. I've never heard this Michael Jackson thing.
Yeah, that's why I think it could be bullshit, but obviously you look at the Michael Jackson interview footage and he's right, pretending to be someone. It's fucked up in retrospect when you kind of know his trajectory. But
If that
Yeah,
were
I
true,
think.
though, that would be extraordinary. If Michael Jackson, like looking the way he does, and like our image of him being what it is, to come out with that voice, I don't know how I would respond to that.
Well, yeah, and like made me think of this with Champ because he's like, okay, performing, especially in the context of like the 80s and 90s, America wasn't that far from kind of the 60s and the civil rights stuff. So like he was probably using the white guy voice to ingratiate himself and do better in entertainment, kind of maybe akin to like Arsenio Hall or something. Arsenio Hall was always like seemingly more black and more respected in the black community, but there was like an element of him being like a respectable black guy who could fit in to the entertainment industry. And this guy kind of reminds me of that a little bit. And so it's kind of sinister to think that when he's committing this stuff, he adopts his kind of like stage persona. He's like, he considers it a performance when he's doing this. And so anyway, he'd cover the ladies' heads. He'd do what he did. And then afterwards he'd say, pray for me. And so I think that was kind of his methodology. And therefore that allowed the investigators to pin a bunch of rapes on this man. But so anyway, that's the story of the Champ. And yeah, I guess in terms of thinking about what type of movie, I was struck by how few good movies there are about comedy, specifically stand-up comedy. And I immediately thought of The King of Comedy. And I guess I wanted to kind of ask you about what were your thoughts on Joker, the Joaquin Phoenix thing, because I heard all the hype. I saw it when at the movie theaters when it came out, and I enjoyed the fact that there was like a big movie that everyone was talking about again. I was like, wow, this reminds me of kind of growing up when everyone the big blockbuster where everyone would kind of there would be like a communal experience element to it. And because of that, I knew that it was never really going to become my favorite movie. But I have to say, I was a little bit frustrated by it in the fact that it wasn't just like inspired by Taxi Driver and the King of Comedy. It was Taxi Driver and King of Comedy. So that really, at the end of it, I was like, yeah, that was kind of almost just blatant stealing. And I felt a little underwhelmed because of that with Joker. What were your thoughts on Joker?
I echo that sentiment 100%. And I remember, people losing their minds saying like, oh my God, this is incel propaganda. It's going to cause mass shootings. And then on the other hand, people like, this is cinema. This isn't a movie. This is cinema. This is high art. Like, it's elevated. This is comic book movies never been done like this before. And for Jesus Christ, it is King of Comedy and Taxi Driver. It's one thing to be influenced by something and wear your influences on your sleeve, but this really was like baby's first Scorsese movie, and
yeah,
it was so obvious that it kind of made me angry that I maybe unfairly looked past the good parts. Joaquin Phoenix's performance it's phenomenal. It's a great performance, and the movie's well shot. On paper, it's a good movie, but it's I don't know. It seems dirty. It seems like on the topic of stand-up comedy, it kind of seems like Amy Schumer just ripping off people's entire routines. Yeah. And like that's so fucking scummy, especially when the evidence is there. It's one thing if you overheard someone and you took notes and you got to it before they did, the burden of proof is on them. But here it's like these movies have existed for decades and they're better. So if you're going to rip something off, you need to make it superior, and it's not. And I remember I had a friend who wouldn't stop talking about Joker, and I was like, dude, we're going to watch King of Comedy. And I told him nothing about the movie. I just put it on, and he said, holy shit, that's Joker. And I said, yeah, I know, except, it has more fucking balls, and it's not as obvious. It's not as blatant with its messaging. And it's, despite the fact that no one dies in King of Comedy, I think it's a much darker movie. I think it's a truly like depressing movie, and it made me feel sick the way few movies do.
Yeah, for sure. I think both Taxi Driver and King of Comedy are more effective because they're contained worlds. Whereas Joker, it's not like you're taking the best parts of Taxi Driver and The King of Comedy. Maybe that was Todd Phillips' intention, but it doesn't work because it's just kind of like it feels you summed it up pretty well. Scorsese for dummies. Like this is your kind of, you can make it palatable and easy to digest. Whereas I think those other two movies are, kind of they're more effective because they're self-contained worlds and you kind of live within that. And I found it fascinating. I believe Scorsese was like an executive producer on Joker, and I'm not sure if this is just bullshit, but like he was attached to possibly direct the movie before Todd Phillips got involved. So it wasn't like it. I think it was like Todd Phillips's story and his concept in terms of the Taxi Driver King of Comedy pastiche. But I don't. If I was Scorsese, I'm not sure how I'd interpret that. You know what I mean? It would be like if you had two kids and one was like Caucasian and one was black. And then they said, oh, look at my kid. It's just like yours. And then they just taken like Lego parts and mishmashed isn't this a beautiful inspiration to your children? I'd be like, yeah, it's kind of racist what you've just done. Like I would be, it just seems like such a ham-fisted show of appreciation to an iconic director. If I was that iconic director, I'd perhaps be like, oh, I was hoping people would be inspired to create slightly better work than what this guy's done.
I'm going to sound very elitist and snobbish right now, but fuck it. I think the fact that Todd Phillips and Martin Scorsese are even in the same conversation is fucking offensive. And I think, like, from Martin Scorsese's point of view, like, someone who's, like, one of, like, the pioneers of filmmaking and has made some of the most seminal films of all time is, like, in a sentence with the guy who made fucking Old School. And what other movies did he... Like, I mean, they're funny movies, but...
Road Trip.
And the fact that suddenly it's like, no, we have to take this guy seriously now. He made art. Look at this movie. It's a commentary on mental health. It's like, it is the most and not that subtlety is the end all be all of storytelling, but it really is like, it would be a good script if like someone in a high school film class made it. It's like, oh, this is a really good script for a 16-year-old. Like, you should polish this and, like, wait a couple years and rewrite it. But for a 16-year-old, like, you should be proud of yourself. And that's what that movie really feels like to me.
Yeah, I agree. And also, it sounds weird, but kind of no hate on Todd Phillips either. The fact that it's more a case of the other, like you said, the other people heaping praise on it is the issue, because he got the opportunity to direct a film with a comic book anti-hero, and he was able to kind of like put his own twist on it. And yeah, he stole from past great films, but it made a ton of money, and it does have kind of, it is at least more interesting. I watched the new Batman on the plane coming back from the DR. That's just the most boring fucking movie in the history of the world.
Why do people love it so much? I saw it with my friend and we both fell asleep in the theater. Like, maybe I'm just becoming my dad, but holy shit, that movie did not need to be 3 hours. It felt like 9 hours. It wasn't fun. It wasn't fun as a comic book movie, and it wasn't like a dark intellectual David Fincher-esque movie either. To me, that movie was a flatline.
I think people are just those stories, the Batman story now. It's been told so many times that you can't get any more juice out of the story. There's no surprises there. So I think people are going in. The movie becomes almost like an AI image generator now, where
that's what it is.
Yeah. So if you tell an AI machine, you're like, okay, it's the Batman story, but we've got Robert Pattinson with kind of like an emo vibe, but he's tough as well. And then you've got like John Turturro and Colin Farrell as kind of like the bad guys, and then just hit enter, and then the AI, and then so the film just produces these images, and so the nerds can be like, oh, it's all about aesthetics. This is the aesthetic of these type of inputs being smushed together in the Batman universe, and they can watch it from a distance and just be like, oh, that's interesting, that's a cool shot. But for someone who's like, yeah, I'd like a little bit of something to go, characters and plot to go with this aesthetic experience, because yeah, aesthetically it was cool looking and dark and grimy, and yeah, probably inspired a lot from that Joker movie and all that. But I was just like, yeah, there's nothing else going on here, and that was very frustrating.
If a movie is going to be 3 hours long, like similarly to a long song, it has to change gears. It can't be in one gear for the duration. I mean, I hate that I'm talking about this like it's an old movie already, but if we're talking about Batman, I think The Dark Knight is still a pretty good movie. Like, I think that nails it. It doesn't take itself too seriously. Like, there's still jokes in the movie, but it's a pretty dark movie, and it treats its audience, with respect, and it has good performances, but it's fun. It doesn't feel its length. The Batman, it's just so they saw Seven, and it's like, we're gonna have this tone, but for 3 fucking hours, and it's never gonna change. There's gonna be no like highs or lows. It's just gonna be dark and grimy, and all the edgelords are gonna love it. And why is Colin Farrell in the movie? There's literally a million fat Italian people that could have taken that part. Why did they put Colin Farrell in bat makeup?
Yeah, no, I think there is that there was that meme going around beforehand of, I believe his name is Richard Kind. He's like this old, kind of like middle-aged Jewish guy who looks exactly, in his most schlubby state, he looks exactly
I know who you're talking about. Yeah.
No, they look identical, but yet Colin Farrell got paid millions to do that. So anyway, we veered off course slightly here, but in terms of comedy movies, I wasn't a fan of the Joker. Funny People was another one that gets referenced from time to time by Judd Apatow. I wasn't really a fan of that either. I think that there were a couple kind of funny moments in that movie where it was just, them, I think they're sitting in a park somewhere. It's like Aziz Ansari and a couple of, pretending to be like the young up and comers, and they're just like shitting on each other. I was like, yeah, that's funny banter type of stuff. And, but I just felt like Apatow crammed in all the heavy cancer stuff once again to be like, you've got comedy and you've got tragedy, and they're sitting right next to each other. It's like, yeah, I get it, Judd. That was a little obvious there. So, can you think of any other movies or that are specifically stand up or on the realm of comedy that are good?
I had Funny People in my mind because I remember up until that point, before Judd Apatow kind of like, that was the norm for comedy from here on out, that they're going to just follow that formula, and that's kind of the death of comedy. That was the first movie of his that I actively did not like at all. And what I found weird for a movie that's like such a big part of it is stand-up. None of the stand-up scenes were funny at all.
Yeah.
Like, it was really rough to watch, and it kind of reminded me how whenever movies show like a movie being made in the movie or a song being written, it always just comes off as false. It never is believable at all. And I feel like stand-up is kind of the same, that for whatever reason, movies just do a really bad job of portraying what stand-up comedy looks like or feels like. And I'm not saying that everyone has to go see a stand-up show, but I've been to a couple shows, and a movie just never captures that vibe ever.
Definitely. Yeah, well, I'm on the some subreddit. I think it might have been Bill Burr's subreddit, but someone expressed something that I've thought for the longest time, essentially the last 10 years since podcasts took off, but saying that I find podcasts funny and have some huge belly laughs listening to a podcast with comedians, but generally their specials never live up to the hype. And someone replied with something pretty interesting where they were like, go and see a stand-up show, don't watch it on Netflix, because even the same material in the crowd, it's just a better experience because it's not, the medium is the message type of thing, where it's not that they're not having to kind of suck the funniest parts and think about how it's going to fit the special. It just kind of exists as a show, and all the weirdness that comes with that. And that's generally been my experience when I've gone to see stand up. Even if the material or comedians haven't been that strong, you kind of, it's elevated because you're kind of there, and I don't know, the communal experience. But I think, yeah, so it's difficult for the best stand-up comedians with good material to even get a good special on film, never mind comedians who are performing in front of a fake audience, just a bunch of extras, and material that hasn't really been tested in front of real crowds. Is just pretend material that exists in a pretend movie. And so, yeah, I would agree with that. And probably the best evidence of that is, I only saw a few episodes, that's all I could stomach, but that Pete Holmes crashing show on HBO, where just super cheesy, and it didn't come across as an authentic experience for the comedian or a crowd member of a comedy show whatsoever. I'm not sure if you saw that one, but yeah, not really. It's a decent concept as well. It's about a comedian who's like crashing on friends' couches in New York City because his wife dumps him, and he's at the beginning of his career, so he's like trying to get his shit together personally and professionally in the stand-up world. So decent concept. I'd listen to Pete Holmes's podcast. All his actual stories from that part of his life were funny and entertaining, but then it didn't translate well. Again, that's an Apatow. Apatow directed some and produced it, so his kind of usual shtick. But anyway, so with this movie, I guess I would probably be leaning on the fact that this guy, and probably the way I'd kick this movie off, I watched that same Rosie O'Donnell YouTube clip where O'Donnell introduces Champ. He does his 3-minute set or whatever, and I was scrolling through the comments whilst I was watching that, and someone said, I was in Sacramento in the late 80s and at a party, and a comedian came to the party and did a set, and then Vince just got up as like a complete novice and did an improvised set just to try it out, and he killed. And this person was like, yeah, he wasn't a funny guy, just a regular dude. And then we all know what happened from there. So this person was lamenting, I wonder if Vince had never gotten up and did well, if he'd bombed that night, whether all this shit would have happened. But anyways,
decide to become a rapist later on, or was he born that? Like, what's interesting, his backstory, what you read, he didn't seem to have like that unusual of an upbringing. For all intents and purposes, like a pretty ordinary life. Nothing that explains that abhorrent behavior.
No. But yeah, I thought that, I don't know, YouTube comments, it's not like they're fact verified or anything, but if that was true, that would be an interesting way to kind of kick off a movie. Someone who isn't funny, doesn't stand out for women or whatever, or you know, I guess on a larger scale. But he's like calculated, he's smart. And I often think that that's kind of an interesting dichotomy. Someone who's paid to be funny for a living, but isn't funny off stage. And that's kind of what I'm thinking this guy was. Nice guy, affable guy, at least on the surface. But then has an ability to kind of understand the formula of because I think that's what's so interesting about comedy in general, at least professional comedy. Everyone's funny to each other in real life. The kind of most morose person, you can have a joke with them because just funny shit happens in life, and it's all to do with subversion of expectations, where something unexpected happens and we're inclined to laugh. That's our kind of programming. So everyone can be funny from time to time, and everyone can participate in funny moments. But then the idea of like turning that into an industry, it immediately becomes false, because you're packaging fake, you're packaging stuff that's meant to be spontaneous and kind of off the cuff, and repackaging it and selling it on. So I like the fact that Vince Champ is someone who's potentially just someone who is calculated and cunning and can figure that out. And so I imagine that this character probably developed quite a disdain for other comedians who were kind of high on their own supply and not realizing the trick they were playing on the audience and themselves, thinking like, oh yeah, I'm just kind of this freewheeling funny person who can kind of just, riff on anything. Whereas he's more a case of like, no, you got the setup, you've got the punchline, you've got the tag, and that's all it is. And those are the inputs you need to worry about. All the other stuff is kind of like, in terms of what you're thinking, is creativity, or just kind of like that zest for life and the kind of funny. That's all just like, it's irrelevant. And so that would be kind of what it would hinge on. It would be a comedian who kind of is just using comedy as very much a vehicle to get some level of power, and doesn't appreciate other comedians or anyone who kind of enjoys comedy around him.
This brings up a lot of interesting points to me, because like with podcasts being so abundant now, and so many of them, at least the ones I listen to, are comedians. Joe Rogan's like, hey, you should do a podcast. You should do a podcast. And then they all do their own podcast. And they make it seem like they're all like one big happy family and they support each other, but they really don't. They're backstabbing, petty. I think comedians are probably like the most childish, hateful, spiteful people in the world. And, Mr. Champ might be the ultimate example of that. And it's not seen on his face, because again, if you just watch that 3-minute clip, he really does just come off as like the most normal, squeaky clean guy. And I was trying to look at his eyes, like maybe his eyes will like betray something about his character, and they really don't. There's nothing unusual about him and nothing that stands out about him. I mean, I did notice he kind of sped through his delivery. Like the way he delivered his jokes was a little awkwardly timed, but not so unusual to really make note of. And I think like a movie like this could also be a good way to explore just other comedians and how they interact with one another, and how they're always backstabbing each other, and how they're petty and they're jealous of one another.
Yeah. Yeah. In terms of the nuts and bolts, you mentioned Seven before. I was actually thinking, because I didn't mind Gone Girl by Fincher. I thought that there were, for what it was like a fun ride.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So I was kind of like, I was thinking maybe Fincher could direct this, because there are elements of kind of comedy in Gone Girl, which I thought were pretty well done. And kind of like the kind of like shocking, thrilling moments as well. So I was thinking of kind of like a Fincher story of like, you'd have Champ told from two point of views, I guess. You'd have kind of like Champ committing these crimes in the comedy world, and then you'd maybe voiceover of him kind of like detailing what he's going to do and how he's going to do it, that kind of style of filmmaking. And then the other side, I was thinking it would be funny in terms of the cop, the detectives on the scene in Nebraska. It would be funny to kind of have like a kind of a buddy cop dynamic where they're actually, you could have the straight-laced one who is kind of funny because he doesn't say much and just kind of like lifts his eyebrow up, or like a Nick Offerman type of character where he's kind of just the straight man. And then you could have a more wacky, funny cop who's just funny in his regular life, but isn't a comedian. And that would be the kind of the juxtaposition of this like cold, calculated, stern psychopath, but operating in the clown world of comedy, and then these cops who are kind of dealing with grisly murders and rapists or whatever, and they're the kind of the actual funny duo who would be you'd actually find more entertaining if you're around them in regular life.
Well, that's something I think is super interesting. I mean, I feel like anyone who's ever made anyone laugh at a certain point, they've heard, you should do stand-up. It's like, shut up. Those are two different, like being funny and knowing like timing and the art or science, whatever you want to call it, stand-up comedy are different things. And I think I've brought it up before, but The Sopranos might be the funniest show ever made. And it's not a comedy. It's just like fat Italian people being fat and Italian, and that is inherently fun. But stand-up, there's different factors that go into making a joke work. And sometimes I don't have anyone offhand that I can name, but when I see different comedians on podcasts, they're not always funny when they're just talking. And I'm not saying they have to be funny 24/7, but sometimes it's like, well, you'd expect like they would say something funny like accidentally at least once. It's like, you're a comedian, for fuck's sake. So sometimes it's like, like maybe it's just when they're making material that they're funny, but in everyday life, even if they're trying to be, they just aren't. And I think that could be an interesting dynamic that, being a comedian, it's a job, and maybe inherently, like, I don't want to give Joker credit, but, like he's always smiling and he's always laughing, but he's not actually being funny. That's just like his face and his condition.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think that I was, in terms of this voiceover, what I think would be interesting would be I'm not sure, this seems like a trope, whether this must have been done, but kind of like someone observing stuff in regular life and then jotting something down in their notepad, and then 5 minutes later in the movie, you see them telling a joke about the observation they've made. And so with this movie, it would be interesting to see like Champ silently observing the folly of human life, and maybe in his regular observations that you get to see in the movie, he says really dark, cynical, depressing stuff that illustrates how he hates the world and everyone. But then 5 minutes later on stage, he's telling her like, what's the deal with people stealing your parking spot? And but in his head, it's like, when someone does that to me, what I think about doing is breaking into their home and cutting off their wife's hands, or so, like something heinous. And like where there's maybe a setup and a punchline and a tag, but in a very dark, disturbing way. But then you see that he's drawing on those dark thoughts, but putting it through the Seinfeld "what's the deal with" filter.
Who's playing Champ? Who do you have in mind?
So I thought of Chappelle as well because of the voice immediately. The issue is I think Dave Chappelle's a little too old now. So I did kind of have this. There's this comedian called Gerard Carmichael.
Yeah, I know Gerard Carmichael.
Yeah, so I think he would be pretty good because he's kind of like slender and age appropriate in terms of Champ. And I was thinking it would maybe be interesting to cast Dave Chappelle as Bill Cosby, as the kind of the older guy who's kind of like doing a similar thing, and maybe they could be kind of like silently simpatico with one another. Like Cosby just senses Champ's vibe, and it's like, you're doing good, boy. You're doing good. Like he could just be like, keep doing what you're doing. And then, but yeah, so that would be like an interest, just like a cameo role where they maybe he gets to open for Champ and they have one wild night together or something. But yeah, he's out now. He's free. How crazy is that?
Thing. I mean, with any luck, Champ will follow in Cosby's footsteps and he'll get out too. Knock on wood.
Co-headlining tour, fucking hell. But but yeah, that they were kind of that was kind of what I was thinking in terms of the casting there. Would be someone kind of like, I don't know. Yeah, and maybe the cops. It would be fun. I'd like to see maybe Nick Offerman as kind of the straight lace one, and I don't know. We spoke about the funny Todd Phillips type of era back in the day before he kind of got too serious, but maybe Vince Vaughn could be the funny cop who's kind of like, he's maybe the guy who should have been a comedian but became a cop, and he's kind of like pushing his comedy, and he's the one who kind of cracks the case with Offerman. I don't know, maybe because I'm a big fan of Vince Vaughn.
Originally, he wanted to be like a serious action star. He wanted to be taken seriously. Like, these are the types of movies I want to do. But then for a while, he got big doing, like, you know, screwball comedies. And then he never really disappeared, but he kind of peaked and then plummeted a little bit. And then he started doing a True Detective and these more serious roles. And I think they didn't really work out for him. I think it's like, dude, just be funny. You're Vince Vaughn. Like, be what people want you to be. And it sounds harsh, but, you know, like, be Vince Vaughn.
Yeah, I think he's also suffered from the I believe it's difficult to be a Republican in Hollywood. Like, there's like Clint Eastwood, James Woods. There's like a few of them where you're allowed to be a Republican, and I think Vince Vaughn, I don't believe he's like a crazy right wing guy, but I think he's like a Republican, and then you get kind of ostracized a little, especially in this political climate. So I've often wondered, why he fell off the map. Yeah, but it could be a combination of him getting sick of being the silly guy, and then maybe his political stuff as well. But so anyway, that would be kind of my and I guess in terms of like the tone of the movie, I think that like I would imagine that kind of the issue here, I would like to see that there's no trap as deadly as the one that you set for yourself. So I could see Champ, because of his stage persona and his professionalism, you know, I'd make him a clean cut guy, not a drinker, not a smoker, and you know, getting not on the surface a womanizer, has a steady girlfriend, so he's got everything going for him. He's on track to become a huge star or a talk show host, the new Arsenio or whatever, but he gets addicted to the college circuit because of what he's doing after hours. So that's what I imagine the kind of like the story here is, that like he'd have the first few times he did it would be a real risk and he wouldn't know what he was doing. Then from there he'd kind of get a hold of it and develop a practice. And then the universe would be telling him like, all right, you've got away with it. Now just stop doing that and you can kind of have a career and be a really successful stand-up. But he's kind of like the sickening pull towards deviance is too strong, and he keeps going out on the college circuit. And so like his girlfriend, and it's like, why aren't you staying in LA? Why aren't you going out for auditions? You could be in the new Jim Carrey movie or whatever. But he's like, no, I've got to get back out there. This is what I was born to do. And that's kind of what leads to his downfall. So yeah, I'd imagine that would be kind of the crux of it. And it seems like from the real story that the cops in Nebraska only really got involved kind of at the end of his rampage, because they figured out that there was a correlation with the rape in Pasadena with the one in Nebraska. But in this fictional story, I'd involve them a lot earlier, where they're on the case from the beginning, and maybe there's like a near miss with Vince Champ just to kind of like add to the drama and the kind of but yeah, that's what I'd be kind of thinking. And then obviously like a big kind of chase and showdown at the end. So I think that would be, if you tried to make it too much about the stand-up comedy world or all that shit, I think that it's seemingly impossible to do it. Many people have tried and failed. So therefore, I think that's why Fincher just kind of bringing that Gone Girl type of vibe would do a really good job with this tale.
See, I think one of the traps that filmmakers fall into, like, oh, if there's a movie about a rapper, we should have a rapper write it or direct it. Or if there's a movie about stand-up comedy, we should have a comedic director direct it. It's like, no, first and foremost, have a good director direct it. It doesn't matter what it's about. I mean, Scorsese's, I mean, maybe he's a funny guy, but he directs mob movies. He directs really dark character studies, and he was perfect for King of Comedy. And it did have funny moments in it. So I think Fincher is like ideal for this kind of movie. It doesn't matter if he directs comedic movies or not. You want the movie to to be intense and to feel like a movie and to really get into the nitty gritty. And I have two questions, because when Champ was assaulting these women, he would always say, "Pray for me." So do you think in his mind he knew what he was doing was wrong and did it anyways? Do you think he knew he was committing a heinous crime? And my second question, I'm not saying if he never did it. I'm saying if he never got caught. If he had never been caught, what level of stardom do you think he'd be at now? Would he be on the Dave Chappelle level? Would he be on like the Joey Diaz level? Or like third, fourth, fifth tier comedian level?
Wow, good questions. First question, I feel like the line "pray for me" is a weird power trip. I don't think that that's an indication of a religious person or someone who is guilty or fearful of damnation or whatever, because I feel like that's a case of putting the heinous act that you've committed like on the devil, or like, oh yeah, sorry about that. That wasn't me. It's like the victim, someone I've just raped. Can you help me out? I think that if you were an actual religious person and you had those type of proclivities, that would be kind of like a battle you'd face directly with your God. Like, why do you need to involve someone else to help out with that? So I think that was a weird kind of like him attempting to wash his hands of it. Like, oh yeah, that wasn't me. That was the devil in me. And I want you to pray for me. That's kind of like, a weird kind of power trip to be like, yeah, that wasn't, don't feel bad about me for the rest of your life. This person, it was the devil inside me. So yeah, that would be kind of an interesting, that's a good title. Pray for me. But yeah, and I'd maybe explore that. It would be interesting to him to kind of go into that detail of like, yeah, of why he says that. Second question, I don't think, no, he'd be in his 60s now, and I think that the vast majority of comedians who were like in their late 40s and 50s when social media and specifically podcasting really took off about 10 years ago, very few of them did well out of it. Like Joey Diaz isn't that much older than Joe Rogan. He just looks about 1,000 years older because of his lifestyle. But he's one person who did well out of it by pure luck, to be honest, because of his friendship with Rogan, and he was kind of connected, and he was the fun older guy. And so I think that the vast majority of comedians of that ilk, unless they were really famous already, so I think that like what I imagine Vince Champ would have done is that he would have done pretty well in terms of like being a regular kind of touring comedian, a headliner for sure. And I think he would have got movie roles. Like he would have been in, comedies perhaps such as, Road Trip and stuff like that, playing, the funny kind of character roles. I couldn't imagine him being a leading man in movies or anything like that. And then I think that, like many of those people, I just assumed he would have imagined that he could have done that forever. And then the internet would have come along. And then unless you kind of were able to kind of connect with your fans directly, then you would have been screwed. There's this comedian I really like called Kevin Brennan. His younger brother, Neil Brennan, is really successful. But Kevin Brennan is like the older, bitter one who's like in his early 60s now. he's got a podcast called Misery Loves Company, where it's essentially just kind of like an inside baseball about the stand-up world, where he shits on all the comedians, but in kind of like a very someone who's like tried to exist within the industry his whole life and played the game and yeah, just suck up, kiss the ring when you have to. But he kind of like Michael Douglas in Falling Down, where he's like, fuck this, I'm going out in style type of thing. So it's a must for people who are interested in the inner workings of the comedy world. It's a must listen. And he referenced the fact that like older comedians have no idea how to do social media. They've got no savvy in terms of like what people want out of Twitter, and they can spot kind of people who are being fake a mile off. So yeah, he's one of the very rare comedians I think kind of like does a good job of speaking to the kids. So I'd imagine Vince Champ would just kind of be like, if he didn't get caught, and I assume that he'd eventually stop doing this so he didn't get caught, he'd just be like a really struggling kind of like perhaps still a headliner, but just having to be a road comic to make money.
Boomer, essentially. He'd be like
exactly.
Boomer. And I was thinking, in terms of my casting, and it is stunt casting, but I just want everyone to consider it for a moment. Back in the 70s and 80s, there was an actor in comedic movies who also went to prison. He's not in prison anymore, and his name is O.J. Simpson. And I was thinking, how amazing would that be if O.J. Simpson played Vincent Champ in the biopic? Like the older version of him.
Fuck. That's a fucking awesome call. Maybe like in the future, in this alternate reality, or maybe even kind of like Vince Champ in the movie. It's a flash forward where his fantasy of like his successful life, like where he's selling out Madison Square Garden and he's still raping afterwards. Like he's
he's just fantasizing about all the fun he's gonna have. Oh Jesus Christ.
That's a hilarious idea for a flash forward. So you like you imagine him like, oh, okay, so in his future he's seeing himself as like finally, listening to his girlfriend and his peers in comedy and thinking, yeah, he's committed and he's doubled down on movies and he's like doing really well. But then, in the fantasy you realize like, oh no, he's still hitting up colleges after hours. And so, OJ for the later years, great call.
OJ, if you're listening.
Have you seen OJ's videos on Twitter?
No. What is OJ up to?
Yeah, hey there, Twitter people. It's OJ Simpson here. He always does it after he plays golf. And he just like it's mainly during the football season. I actually learned about this through Kevin Brennan's podcast where they were talking about his videos. But yeah, he just gives like random, the Baltimore Ravens, they're looking good this year. You know what I mean? the offensive line, damn. But yeah, you're just looking at him and it's like, yeah, you cut your girlfriend's neck off, like her head off. It's like it's impossible not to think that. You look at Louis C.K. and it's like, yeah, you were jerking off in front of women. It is the elephant in your mind when you're looking at these people. But OJ's like, and that's the Tim Dillon had a riff on this. He's like, he looks healthy. He looks happy. He looks like
he's murder. He looks great.
Looks great. So yeah, anyway, he does these bizarre, hey, Twitter people, videos where he just kind of like, he's playing golf. He's living life down in Florida. And that's a particularly weird American thing where if you can kind of, if you can be, what's the word? Kind of like you have no shame. Having no shame is really celebrated in America. Fame is worshipped here. If you can kind of like develop a skill set or a tool to make you stand out, because there's no kind of like monarchy or kind of king, or in a place like Australia or Britain, as far as I understand it, with the class system specifically in Britain, if you develop a skill set that gives you some type of notoriety, that's cool. But let's get real. You're never going to be higher than the queen or the prince or that family, or I guess kind of like blue bloods in general. Whereas here, if you can do that, you become royalty. And there are people who kind of crash and burn. But if you can kind of look beyond your own faults and major failings as a human and still walk around and be like, I'm still OJ Simpson, there's a weird part of the culture here that celebrates that and thinks like they don't. I don't know. It's this weird thing where public shaming definitely exists here, but if for those people who really double down on themselves, you're kind of like you're celebrated warts and all, like no other place.
Yeah, I mean it's not to beat a dead horse, but it's Donald Trump. It's the idea that I think deep down, even his most adamant supporters know he's a dipshit, but because he gets away with it, that's what they like. They like that he triggers the libs. They like that he says mean shit because it's all shit they want to say, and they see him getting away with it. Like, yeah, fuck yeah, fuck yeah. And I think with OJ, it's kind of the same thing.
Where did you? I haven't read any specifics about the story yet, but when I was going to bed last night, I saw that the FBI raided Mar-a-Lago. Did you hear about that?
I heard about it, and he made a statement saying like it's unjust and like I've been cooperating with them from the beginning. He hasn't, and I mean I don't know if any revelations have come out, but he made a statement saying how it's illegal, and he's like, why weren't they investigating Hillary and her emails? They did, and just a bunch of typical Trump bullshit.
Do you think they're going to get him? Do you think this is the beginning of his downfall, or will the Teflon Don continue to slide through?
I think if it were any other country on earth, yes. But I feel like in America, we've set it up that if you're rich enough and powerful enough, you won't get punished. I mean, the only time someone gets punished who's like a billionaire in the U.S. is if the people they're ripping off are other billionaires. What was his name, that media tycoon?
Murdoch?
Madoff, right?
Oh, Bernie Madoff. Okay, yeah.
I mean, he was like a fall guy. Like, well, like he crossed the line when he started like fucking us over. So he's got to go.
All right.
So I think Trump, what was that old thing he said? Maybe even before he was president, that he could go out and shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and it wouldn't change anything. I think that's actually true. That's not just a metaphor. Like, that's actually a fact.
I wonder because the kind of the natural conclusion of the Trump story is him to run in 2024. And that's clearly what he's gunning for, a man with an ego like that. He wants a second chance, second bite of the cherry. And I think that I listened to something very interesting on the Sam Harris podcast where he was interviewing a guy who used to be a Republican, and then he became, during the election cycle, he became like a never Trump person because he was disgusted by the way Trump was presenting himself during the 2016 election cycle. And then after the Republicans elected him and supported him as their candidate against Hillary, he became like a never Republican. He opted out of that party. So, but at the time he was in it, and he lived in a Republican area with tons of Christian people. And Sam Harris asked a good question. He was like, with the Christian conservatives, I don't understand how they could support and value someone like Donald Trump, considering his personal life and just the way he kind of presents himself. And not only, I struggle to understand how they got behind him in the beginning, but then I really struggled to see how many of them have stuck by him, considering all the shit that's happened since then. And he asked this dude, was like, can you enlighten me? And the guy made a really interesting point where he was like, Hillary was destined to win. It was like 98%, according to the New Yorker, whatever the Google, turn it into a sports game of the probability of the win. And so they hated that woman and kind of like, I guess everything she represented would be more accurate, but she was like the worst pick in terms of like really triggering those type of people with everything they hate. And so the fact that Donald Trump won, the Christian conservatives saw it as a sign from God. They saw it as God interfering with our human comings and goings, and so therefore they see Donald Trump as kind of like a chosen one. So I thought that was very enlightening, because it did seem miraculous, the fact that he was able to win there. And I often think that, like, with all these investigations and stuff like that, if you're going to go after him, I wonder if there's any type of consideration from the FBI in terms of like, if we go after him, we have to get him, because if we don't get him, it just adds to this mythology that he's created.
Yeah. So it might even be like, don't even bother, because it's just going to embolden him and his base, and it's going to prove them right. Like, see, they're after us, and I've been proven innocent time and again. I mean, that's what happened with whatever his name was, who was doing the whole Russiagate thing. And that was weak sauce from the beginning. Like, that was never going to amount to anything. And that was a terrible thing to, like, try to make that your entire, like, way to bring him down. That was never going to work.
Yeah. Well, I guess you don't really want to operate on under fear all the time. And like, in theory, aren't the FBI and CIA meant to be impartial? They're just like, they would investigate whoever.
It's America, though. Nothing's impartial. Like, that's become abundantly clear. Like, no organization is impartial.
Yeah.
Meant to be. Yeah. I mean, ideally, yeah.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thought experiment. If Donald Trump got indicted and sent to prison for this, and that would help his mythology, and his fans would be like, get him out. But would his supporters, if he said, okay, Don Jr., you're running in my place because you're not in prison, would his supporters go and vote for Don Jr.? My hunch is probably no. They'd be more inclined on like, let's free Donald out of prison. Whereas, so I think that if they can indict him and put him in jail and therefore stop him from running in 2024 that way, then I think it will be successful. But if they go after him and fail, and he's able to run himself in 2024, I can't see how that's not just going to rally his base in an extreme way and kind of. But as a non-American living here, it's an amazing story kind of unfolding. Yeah. It's very fascinating.
It's the most American story ever told.
Definitely.
And I think that guest that Sam Harris had on, explaining like, how do these people who profess to be like peace-loving Christians like fall for this? I think it's Occam's razor. Americans are dumb. I think it's that simple. I think Americans as a whole are very, very stupid and emotionally manipulative. Is that a word? I'm American. See, I'm stupid. Manipulatable? Manipulative. Jesus Christ.
Easily manipulated. Yeah.
I see. I can't help it. I was born American.
To kind of wrap things up, I'm curious, did you watch the Bo Burnham Inside comedy special?
I didn't, and this is weird. I like Bo Burnham as a person. I've seen the movie he directed, and I thought it's pretty good. I can't get past comedians who do music on stage.
Yeah.
That's just not something I could get past.
Yeah, no, I used to like comedy songs. Tenacious D when I was 13.
That's an exception. Yeah. Hold on, Tenacious D still. I mean, I'm scared to listen to them now, but 13-year-old me loved the shit out of them.
They're lovable as fuck, and it's catchy music. Yeah. But so I guess that hit me at the right age. But then as I got older, it's been described pretty well by others, but musical comedy is kind of like a cheat code, because it gives you the brain that kind of like, oh, this is a fun melody, and like and that rhymed, and then they tied that all together with this punchline, and that rhymed as well. So it gives you like all these like little endorphin pops. But what essentially it allows you to do is provide a distraction from the fact that a regular comedian will maybe have to tell, 10 jokes in a minute. But with a comedy, you can really slow down your jokes per minute rate, and you can just disguise it. But the payoff is seemingly of equal, if not better value, because it's got a cool crescendo which aligns with the core. So it's kind of a trick. I acknowledge that, and yeah, I wouldn't necessarily think musical comedy is up there. But the special, just at least in an artistic achievement, it's worth a watch, because I think that Bo Burnham's pretty brilliant at tapping into kind of the broader themes, and that's, I guess, a combination of the technology that we use isolating one another, and then also the pandemic being forced isolation, forced confrontation with our own fears, insecurities, because we're stuck at home with ourselves. So I watched it when I was feeling really fucking vulnerable after a weekend of drinking and drugging in Toronto on a Sunday morning. My buddy was like a big fan, and we watched it together, and it's worth a watch, just in terms of like an exploration of at least where comedy might go, as opposed to the guy, and ladies and gentlemen, presents Bill Burr, and then he comes out and tells his jokes. I watched the Bill Burr special recently where that was kind of the exact opposite. There was no bells and whistles, just performing to a crowd, jokes. He got introduced at the beginning. He said thank you at the end, and he got off stage, and that was good as well. But in terms of like something more experimental and kind of an exploration of where comedy might go, yeah, I think Bo Burnham seems to be kind of on the edge of that. All right, let's wrap it. Thanks for your time, Davey. And yeah, we'll chat next week.
Cheers.